Meanwhile, in Israel, two human rights groups have released a report documenting what they call the unlawful imprisonment of some 335 Palestinians in Israeli jails. The group B'Tselem and Hamoked say Israel is violating international law by holding the prisoners without charge or trial for years on end. The 335 figure could be substantially conservative. There are an estimated 10,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails. In Puerto Rico, tens of thousands of people are expected to take part in an island-wide strike today against massive public layoffs. The Puerto Rican governor, Luis Fortuno, is proceeding with plans to fire some 17,000 workers next month, including school teachers, social workers, and healthcare workers. The job cuts would bring total government layoffs in Puerto Rico this year to nearly 25,000. Union leaders say some 100,000 people will converge on the Plaza Las Americas in the largest of several planned rallies. In addition to cutting jobs, Governor Fortuno has drawn criticism for threatening to charge protesters with terrorism if they interfere with the flow of goods at Puerto Rican ports. A federal judge is barring members of the public from a series of pretrial hearings in the case against 5 Blackwater mercenaries involved in killing 17 Iraqis in Baghdad 2 years ago. On Wednesday, U.S. District Judge Ricardo Urbina said he would close the trial in order to shield witnesses and jurors, as well as ensure a fair hearing for the accused. The U.S. military has announced it's met all of its annual recruiting goals for the first time in 35 years. In announcing the milestone, the Pentagon said the nation's worst economic crisis since the Great Depression played a key role in boosting enlistments. Senior Pentagon official Curtis Gilroy said a 10% increase in the national unemployment rate generally translates into a 4 to 6% improvement in recruiting goals. Another top official, Bill Carr, called the recession, quote, a force, adding, quote, unemployment allowed us to be for much of the year in a very favorable position. The military, meanwhile, is looking into plans to bring recruiting to middle schools across the nation. A Kansas school district has implemented a middle school program based on the Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps curriculum. The program is being studied to see if it can be expanded nationwide. In housing news, new figures show the number of homes facing foreclosure has risen over 5% in recent months. According to Realty Track, 938,000 homes were at risk of foreclosure for the 3-month period ending last month, up from 890,000 in the prior 3 months. Foreclosure-related filings are on pace to reach around 3.5 million this year, up from 2.3 million in 2008. And the New York Times has revealed that environmental cleanup technology at dozens of U.S. coal factories has often led to the contamination of local water supplies. Coal plants that have installed scrubbers to filter air emissions have dumped hundreds of thousands of gallons of water pollution into local rivers and streams. Only 1 out of 43 power plants and electric utilities has been required to limit dumping of the toxin barium, which has been linked to heart problems and other organ diseases. Even when emissions have been regulated, 90% of plants that violated the Clean Water Act since 2004 have escaped penalties or fines. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
And welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The Dow Jones Industrial Average topped 10,000 Wednesday for the first time in a year as JPMorgan Chase reported massive profits in the third quarter. The nation's second-largest bank took in $3.6 billion during the last 3 months. JPMorgan is not the only bank making billions. Earlier this morning, Goldman Sachs announced it made about $3.2 billion in the third quarter. Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal is reporting that major U.S. banks and securities firms are on pace to pay their employees about $140 billion this year, a record high. Goldman Sachs alone is set to pay out at least $20 billion in bonuses. That's an average of $700,000 per employee. The record bonuses come less than a year after taxpayers bailed out many of those same financial institutions. While Wall Street is on the path of recovery, the real economy remains in a state of crisis. It was just announced that U.S. foreclosure filings climbed to a record high in the third quarter. Nearly 940,000 homes received a default notice or were repossessed by banks. That's a 23% increase from a year earlier. Meanwhile, economists project the national unemployment rate will soon top 10%.
On Capitol Hill, lawmakers have been slow to implement any meaningful reform to help protect consumers and to curb what's been described as Wall Street's casino. On Wednesday, the House Financial Services Committee began marking up a bill that would create a Consumer Financial Protection Agency and introduce the first regulation of the exotic financial instruments known as derivatives. The finance and business communities have been lobbying against both reform measures. To talk more about this, we're joined by former bank regulator William Black. You might recognize him from Michael Moore's film Capitalism, a Love Story. During the 1980s, Black helped expose the savings and loans scandal. He now teaches at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and is the author of the book, The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One, How Corporate Executives and Politicians Looted the S&L Industry. Bill Black, welcome to Democracy Now! Your comment on just the latest figures. Dow Jones tops 10,000, Wall Street reports massive profits, executives receive record bonuses, and foreclosures also at a record high.
It's one of the proofs that the real economy and the finance world have been completely unhinged. Finance is supposed to exist for only one purpose, to make the real economy work better. But now the finance simply works for finance, and in particular for the elites within finance. And they harm the real economy on a regular basis, and periodically they come close to destroying the real economy.
And William Black, where is the outrage? It seems to me at this stage, as the foreclosures continue to escalate in numbers, and yet we're seeing these enormous profits less than a year after the financial crisis. There doesn't seem to be the kind of outrage even in Congress that there was 6 months or 8 months ago.
There's no palpable outrage, certainly not in Congress. The reform efforts on derivatives, for example, are a scandal. They exempt virtually all of the problem derivatives, and they're designed to exempt it. And that's the bill is introduced. And of course, it's likely to get worse with additional lobbying from the special interests. Link the things that you've just been talking about. You talked about foreclosures reaching record highs, but in fact, foreclosures relative to delinquencies are quite low compared to historical ratios. In other words, banks have tons of folks who are not paying their mortgages on time, and they're not foreclosing. And the reason they're not foreclosing is once you foreclose, you have to recognize losses under the accounting rules. And the banks gimmicked the accounting rules. They put pressure on Congress, and Congress put pressure on the accounting profession to gimmick the accounting rules now about a year ago. Now these bonuses, of course, are paid compared to alleged profits. What happens if you understate your losses dramatically? You report much higher profits and much higher bonuses. So this is a web of fraud in which they are getting as much as they can before the place goes to hell in a handbasket again.
William Black, talk about Timothy Geithner, talk about Lawrence Summers, talk about Obama's inner circle and what they have to gain from this.
Well, I mean, Summers, for example, you talked about Geithner's aides and how much money they had made. And of course, it's absurdly large, and they're making it typically for not doing much of anything. But they're taking their cue from Summers, who got $5 million roughly for working 1 day a week in areas he had no expertise. So, you know, once you leave the federal service, then these interests that you were very helpful to find a way to make you spectacularly rich. And they know that that's what's coming in their future. So that's part of the problem. But the bigger part of the problem in many ways is that they have such an ideology about the market and its ability to deal with all problems that has no basis in reality, has been exposed in this crisis as completely fictional, and yet they can't give it up. I mean, think of yourself as one of these professors who's been trained in the Milton Friedman-ish views, and you're in your 50s, and you've been saying, you know, everything you've said in your career is wrong. Everything you've learned in your career is wrong. All of your areas of expertise are wrong. Are you going to admit that? hi, I've been misleading you, and I'm sorry I caused this disaster, and by the way, I have no meaningful skills or experience.
Would Alan
It's not gonna
Greenspan
happen.
fit into that picture?